August 2010, a summer afternoon in London. Prince Andrew sat in his private study and typed a message that would, 16 years later, become the most incriminating piece of evidence against him. The email was addressed to Jeffrey Epstein. The subject line read simply, "Next month. Venues?" What followed was not the formal correspondence of two men merely acquainted through distant social circles. It was the casual, familiar exchange of two men who understood each other, who had built something over years that transcended polite social convention. Andrew's message contained specific requests. He wanted Epstein's opinion on several locations for an upcoming event. He mentioned mutual friends by name, individuals Epstein would introduce him to, apparently. He asked for introductions to specific women, described only by first names and brief physical descriptions. The tone was transactional in a way that suggested these exchanges happened regularly, that this was a routine part of their relationship. What made the email extraordinary was not its existence, but its timing. This was August 2010. Jeffrey Epstein had been convicted of soliciting prostitution from a minor in 2008. He had served his prison sentence. He had been released, and within months of his release, Prince Andrew was not just maintaining contact with him, he was actively soliciting his assistance in making social arrangements. The palace had always insisted this was impossible. The palace had maintained, through decades of media inquiries and through multiple official statements, that Prince Andrew's friendship with Epstein had been peripheral, that it had been forged before anyone understood the true nature of Epstein's crimes, and that any continued contact had been minimal and inconsequential. The 2010 email made all of these claims obviously false. But there was more. The documents revealed a series of messages between Andrew and Epstein that spanned nearly a decade. In one message from 2013, Andrew was asking Epstein for financial advice, not just casual advice, but detailed guidance about structuring investments and managing wealth in ways that would minimize tax obligations. Another message, from 2015, showed Andrew asking Epstein to facilitate an introduction to a prominent businessman who was seeking to expand his operations into Eastern Europe. The businessman in question was later found to have ties to organized crime. These emails painted a picture of a royal who was not just passively maintaining a friendship with a convicted sex offender, but who was actively leveraging that friendship for personal and financial benefit. Andrew had not stumbled into a relationship with Epstein. He had cultivated it. He had invested in it. He had asked for favors from it, and he had done so with full knowledge of who Epstein was and what he had been convicted of. The palace's immediate response was panic. Advisors scrambled to develop talking points, to prepare statements, to figure out how to contain the damage. The initial instinct was to argue that the emails had been misinterpreted, that they required context, that the media was engaging in sensationalism. But the emails were remarkably clear. There was no ambiguity. There was no hidden meaning. Andrew had simply been conducting business with Epstein in the way that someone would conduct business with a trusted associate. Within 48 hours, King Charles had demanded an explanation from Andrew. The meeting between them, according to those who witnessed its aftermath, was brutal. Charles was reported to have been furious, not just at Andrew's betrayal of the institution, but at Andrew's apparent stupidity in creating a written record of his relationship with Epstein. Charles understood immediately that the emails were not just damaging to Andrew, they were damaging to the entire institution. They suggested that the palace had been complicit in protecting a royal who was maintaining a relationship with a serial predator. Andrew's response was initially defiant. He argued that the emails had been taken out of context. He argued that his friendship with Epstein had been forged decades earlier, when Epstein had seemed like a respectable financier. He argued that continuing the relationship, even after Epstein's conviction, had been a matter of simple friendship and loyalty. But these arguments crumbled under scrutiny. The emails made clear that Andrew was not maintaining a friendship out of loyalty to an old acquaintance. He was actively seeking favors from Epstein, was asking for introductions and financial advice, was treating him as a valuable associate. What shocked observers most was not just the content of the emails, but what they revealed about Andrew's character. Here was a man of considerable privilege, with access to the world's most prestigious advisors and consultants, and yet he was apparently going to Jeffrey Epstein, a man with a criminal record, for financial and business advice. The only plausible explanation was that Andrew valued Epstein's advice not because Epstein was a particularly skilled financier, but because Epstein had access to networks and to information that Andrew wanted access to. The subsequent investigation into Andrew's relationship with Epstein revealed something even more disturbing than the emails themselves. Financial records showed that Andrew had transferred substantial sums of money to accounts associated with Epstein. These were not loans. They were not investments in any traditional sense. Instead, they appeared to be payments for services rendered, services that were never explicitly detailed in any document, but whose nature could be inferred from the pattern of payments and from the timing of those payments relative to specific events. In one instance, Andrew had made a payment of £250,000 to an Epstein-controlled account immediately following a trip to New York. The trip appeared to have been arranged by Epstein. The accommodations had been provided by Epstein, and the payment had followed shortly after Andrew's return. Similar patterns emerged in the financial records for multiple trips, multiple events, multiple occasions when Andrew had apparently leveraged Epstein's network for his own purposes. The most damaging revelation came when investigators uncovered evidence that Andrew had used Epstein's connections to facilitate a business deal worth millions of pounds. The deal had involved the sale of military technology to a foreign government, a deal that required government approval and that required navigating complex regulatory frameworks. Andrew had apparently turned to Epstein for help in navigating these complexities. Epstein, through his network of connections, had apparently facilitated the necessary approvals, and Andrew had paid him handsomely for doing so. This revelation raised questions that went far beyond Andrew's personal judgment. It raised questions about whether Andrew had been using his position within the royal family to facilitate business deals that benefited Epstein or Epstein's associates. It raised questions about whether Andrew had been leveraging his royal status for personal financial gain. And it raised questions about whether the palace had been aware of these arrangements and had chosen not to intervene. The palace's institutional response was to launch yet another investigation, this time focused specifically on Andrew's financial relationships and on the question of whether palace resources or palace connections had been used to facilitate Epstein's business interests. What this investigation revealed was a pattern of Andrew using his royal status, his royal connections, and his access to palace resources in ways that benefited Epstein or that created obligations that Epstein could later leverage. For example, Andrew had hosted multiple events at palace facilities, events that included individuals who were part of Epstein's network. These events had provided opportunities for Epstein's associates to network with wealthy individuals and with government officials. Andrew had apparently not charged for the use of palace facilities, suggesting that he saw value in facilitating these connections. The value, presumably, came from the reciprocal opportunities that Epstein provided to Andrew. Catherine, in her role as an institutional reformer, was particularly vocal about the implications of Andrew's behavior. She made a series of statements arguing that the emails and the financial records revealed something fundamental about how the royal family had operated, as a network of privilege and power that could be leveraged for personal gain, and that could be used to facilitate the business interests of wealthy and powerful individuals regardless of the moral character of those individuals. Catherine argued that Andrew's behavior was not anomalous. Rather, it was symptomatic of a broader institutional culture in which royal status was treated as a commodity, as something that could be leveraged for personal or financial benefit. She argued that genuine institutional reform required not just the removal of Andrew from his official positions, but a fundamental transformation of how the royal family understood its relationship to wealth and power. The emails also revealed something about Andrew's understanding of his own position within the institution. In one message to Epstein, Andrew had written, "My position provides certain advantages. I can access conversations and information that would be difficult for you to obtain otherwise. In exchange, your network provides me with opportunities I would not otherwise have." This statement, while not explicitly stating a quid pro quo, made clear that Andrew understood his relationship with Epstein to be transactional, that he was trading access to royal connections and information for access to Epstein's network. This revelation triggered a significant institutional crisis. If Andrew had been sharing information with Epstein, what information had he shared? Had he been discussing matters of national security? Had he been discussing palace decision-making processes? Had he been providing Epstein with intelligence about government policies or government personnel? The implications were potentially catastrophic. An emergency meeting was convened at the palace involving the Queen's private secretary, the Lord Chamberlain, senior intelligence officials, and representatives from the Foreign Office. The meeting focused on assessing the damage that might have been done by Andrew's apparent willingness to share information with Epstein. While no evidence was found of Andrew having shared classified information, the mere possibility that he might have done so was extraordinarily troubling. King Charles made the decision that Andrew's removal from public life was insufficient. Andrew's security clearance was revoked. His access to palace facilities was restricted. His communications were monitored. In effect, Andrew was placed under a form of house arrest, allowed to remain a member of the royal family, but stripped of any meaningful role or authority. The broader significance of Andrew's emails and financial records was that they revealed how extensively the royal family had been entangled with Epstein's network. Andrew had not been unique in his willingness to maintain a relationship with Epstein or to leverage that relationship for personal benefit. Other members of the extended royal family had done similar things, though apparently on a smaller scale. The palace had not just failed to distance itself from Epstein, it had become actively engaged with him, had facilitated his access to networks and to individuals, and had benefited from his connections. William, observing the cascade of revelations about his uncle, made a significant personal decision. He announced that he would be implementing a comprehensive program of transparency and accountability within the royal household. Every palace employee would be required to disclose all significant financial relationships outside the palace. Every palace facility would be subject to oversight to ensure that it was not being used to facilitate the business interests of individuals with questionable backgrounds. And every member of the royal family would be required to undergo training on conflict of interest and on the proper use of royal status. These announcements marked a significant departure from how the palace had historically operated. The palace had long maintained that its internal affairs were its own business, that transparency about palace decision-making or palace finances would compromise the institution's ability to function effectively. William was arguing, by contrast, that genuine institutional strength came not from secrecy, but from transparency and accountability. The implementation of William's transparency initiative triggered significant internal resistance within the palace. Senior courtiers who had served the institution for decades argued that the reforms would compromise the palace's dignity and its ability to conduct business confidentially. They argued that transparency about financial relationships would expose sensitive matters to public scrutiny and would create vulnerabilities that could be exploited by institutional rivals or by hostile actors. But William was unmoved by these arguments. He understood that the palace's credibility had been so severely damaged by the succession of revelations about its complicity with Epstein that half measures and symbolic reforms would be insufficient. The institution needed to undergo a genuine transformation, one that would demonstrate to the public that the palace was serious about accountability and about preventing future situations in which members of the royal family could leverage their status for personal gain or to facilitate the business interests of individuals with questionable backgrounds. The Transparency Initiative also revealed other problematic relationships that had not previously been public knowledge. A distant cousin of the royal family was found to have been receiving significant financial support from an individual who was under investigation for securities fraud. Another family member had apparently used palace connections to facilitate a real estate deal that involved substantial, undisclosed conflicts of interest. While none of these revelations rose to the level of Andrew's involvement with Epstein, they reinforced the impression that the palace had developed a culture in which the exploitation of royal status for personal or financial benefit had become normalized. Catherine took a particularly active role in addressing the broader cultural issues that these revelations had exposed. She commissioned a comprehensive study of palace culture, conducted by an external team of organizational psychologists and business ethics experts. The study examined how the palace's historical approach to secrecy and institutional protection had created an environment in which members of the royal family felt entitled to use their status for personal benefit, and in which palace staff felt unable to raise concerns about inappropriate behavior without risking their career. The study's findings were damning. It revealed that the palace had developed what amounted to a permission structure for ethical violations. Palace staff were trained to prioritize institutional loyalty over broader considerations of justice and accountability. Members of the royal family had received implicit messaging that their status exempted them from normal ethical constraints, and oversight mechanisms had been deliberately designed to be weak and to protect institutional interests rather than to hold individuals accountable for their behavior. In response to these findings, Catherine implemented a comprehensive cultural transformation program. New training was required for all palace staff. New oversight mechanisms were established with genuine independence and authority. And a new organizational philosophy was articulated, one that positioned accountability and transparency as core institutional values rather than as threats to institutional stability. The revelations about Andrew's emails and financial relationships also had significant implications for how the broader public understood the monarchy. Polls conducted in the months following the revelations showed a notable decline in public support for the institution. Trust in the royal family dropped significantly, particularly among younger demographics. The palace was no longer seen as an institution devoted to service and to the public good, but rather as an institution devoted to the protection of privilege and the facilitation of the personal interests of its members. This decline in public support created significant pressure for additional reforms. Members of Parliament began raising questions about the palace's continued access to taxpayer funding. Journalists launched investigations into the palace's financial arrangements and into the ways that palace resources had been used by family members. Civil society organizations began calling for the monarchy to be subject to the same oversight and accountability mechanisms that applied to other major institutions. The palace's response was to accelerate its reform efforts. Catherine announced a comprehensive review of all palace finances, with the commitment that the results would be made public. William announced that members of the royal family would henceforth be required to disclose all external financial relationships and all conflicts of interest. And King Charles issued a statement indicating that the palace would be implementing new governance structures designed to ensure genuine oversight and accountability. But perhaps the most significant response came from Andrew himself. In the face of overwhelming evidence of his inappropriate relationships with Epstein and of his willingness to leverage his royal status for personal and financial benefit, Andrew made the decision to withdraw from the royal family entirely. He renounced his royal status. He returned the titles that had been granted to him. He committed to living a private life, outside the glare of institutional scrutiny and outside the protection of royal privilege. Andrew's withdrawal was announced through a carefully worded statement released by the palace. The statement indicated that Andrew had made this decision voluntarily, that the palace respected his decision, and that the institution would support him in his transition to private life. But observers understood what was actually happening. Andrew was being expelled from the institution. He was being cast out, stripped of his status, and left to face the consequences of his actions without the protection of royal privilege. For the palace, Andrew's withdrawal represented both a victory and a defeat. It was a victory in the sense that it removed from the institution a figure whose behavior had become indefensible. But it was a defeat in the sense that it represented a failure of the institution to address the problems that had enabled Andrew's behavior in the first place. The palace had not fixed the fundamental problems in its culture and its governance structures. It had simply removed the most visible symbol of those problems. Catherine understood this reality. In her public statements about Andrew's withdrawal, she acknowledged that removing Andrew was necessary but insufficient. The palace needed to implement genuine cultural and structural reforms if it was to prevent similar situations from arising in the future. She committed herself to leading this reform effort, to ensuring that the palace would be transformed from an institution devoted to the protection of privilege into an institution genuinely devoted to accountability and to the public good. The months following Andrew's withdrawal were consumed by the ongoing implementation of palace reforms. New policies were developed, new oversight structures were established, new training programs were implemented, and gradually the palace began to transform itself. Not overnight, and not without continued resistance from those invested in the old ways of operating, but genuinely and substantively. By the end of 2026, more than a year after the cascade of revelations about Prince Andrew's emails and financial relationships with Epstein had begun, the palace had undergone a fundamental institutional transformation. Andrew was gone, not just from public life, but from the royal family itself. The protection that the institution had once extended to its members had been withdrawn, and the palace had begun the difficult work of rebuilding its credibility through genuine accountability and reform. Andrew's life after leaving the royal family was notably diminished. He retained some wealth, his private resources had not been confiscated, but he had lost status, access, and the protection of institutional power. He lived quietly, largely out of the public eye, a cautionary tale about what happened when institutional privilege was exploited for personal gain. Occasionally, journalists would track him down for interviews or for photographs, but these encounters only reinforced the image of a man who had lost everything that had once mattered to him. For the palace, the removal of Andrew represented a symbolic break with the past. The institution was signaling, clearly and unambiguously, that it would no longer protect family members who violated basic ethical standards. It would no longer use institutional power to shield individuals from accountability. It would no longer allow its status and resources to be leveraged for personal or financial benefit. Catherine emerged from this period as the institutional leader who had driven the reform process. She had refused to defend the institution's past behavior. She had acknowledged failures openly and without equivocation. She had implemented substantive reforms, not just symbolic gestures, and she had positioned the next generation of royal leadership as fundamentally committed to different values than the generation that had preceded them. William, working alongside Catherine, had implemented the transparency initiatives that had gradually transformed how the palace operated. Palace finances became more open. Conflicts of interest were disclosed. External oversight mechanisms were established. The palace was becoming, gradually but demonstrably, a different kind of institution, one that understood that institutional credibility came not from the ability to hide wrongdoing, but from the willingness to acknowledge it and to commit to genuine reform. King Charles, in the final months before formally transitioning significant governance responsibilities to William and Catherine, issued a comprehensive statement reflecting on the Epstein crisis and on what it had revealed about the palace. Charles acknowledged that the institution had failed in its fundamental responsibilities. He acknowledged that members of the royal family had exploited their status for personal gain. He acknowledged that the palace had developed institutional mechanisms for protecting wrongdoing rather than for preventing it. But Charles also spoke about the possibility of redemption and transformation. He argued that the palace had the opportunity to become an institution that was fundamentally different from what it had been, an institution based on genuine accountability, on authentic service, and on a commitment to justice that superseded the protection of privilege. He committed himself, in his remaining time as reigning monarch, to supporting the reform efforts that were being led by the next generation. The public's response to these developments was notably different from how they had responded to previous palace crises. Rather than viewing the reforms as an attempt to minimize damage and move forward, the public appeared to understand them as a genuine commitment to institutional change. Polls showed a gradual increase in public support for the monarchy as it became clear that the institution was serious about accountability and reform. The broader implications of the Epstein crisis and of the palace's response to it extended far beyond the institution itself. The revelations had exposed the mechanisms through which predatory individuals could infiltrate elite institutions, could cultivate relationships with powerful individuals, and could leverage those relationships to gain access and influence. The palace's response, acknowledging failures, implementing reforms, and committing to genuine accountability, had provided a model for how other institutions might respond to similar crises. Universities began reviewing their fundraising practices to ensure that they were not accepting donations from individuals with questionable backgrounds. Charitable organizations implemented new vetting procedures for major donors. Corporate boards began establishing stronger oversight mechanisms for executive behavior and for conflicts of interest. The Epstein crisis had, in a strange way, catalyzed a broader institutional reckoning about accountability and about the ways in which the pursuit of wealth and the protection of privilege could enable serious wrongdoing. For Andrew, the ultimate consequence of his relationship with Epstein was not criminal prosecution. The evidence, while damning, did not meet the threshold for criminal charges. Instead, it was something that many people considered to be a more fundamental punishment: the loss of status, the loss of access, the loss of the privilege that had defined his entire life. Andrew had spent his entire existence within the cocoon of royal protection. Now, stripped of that protection, he had to confront the reality of what he had done and who he had become. In the years that followed, Andrew's name became synonymous with institutional corruption and moral compromise. When scholars wrote about how elite institutions had enabled predatory behavior, they referenced Andrew's emails and financial relationships with Epstein. When ethics professors taught about conflicts of interest and about the exploitation of institutional privilege, they used Andrew as a case study. Andrew had become, in essence, a permanent symbol of institutional failure and of the dangers of unchecked privilege. Catherine, as the institutional leader who had driven the palace's transformation, represented something different. She represented the possibility of genuine change, of authentic accountability, and of an institution that was willing to hold even its most privileged members responsible for their actions. She represented a commitment to justice that superseded the protection of privilege, and to transparency that superseded the maintenance of secrecy. By early 2027, the palace had become a demonstrably different institution than it had been 2 years earlier. Not everything had changed. Institutional change happens gradually, and there remains significant resistance to reform from those invested in the old ways of operating. But the fundamental trajectory was clear. The palace was moving toward greater accountability, greater transparency, and greater commitment to justice. The Epstein documents, and specifically the revelations about Prince Andrew's relationship with Epstein, had served as a crucible in which the palace's fundamental commitments had been tested and ultimately transformed. The palace had been forced to confront its own complicity in enabling predatory behavior, to acknowledge its failures, and to commit to genuine reform. And in doing so, the institution had demonstrated that transformation was possible, that even the most ancient and most resistant institutions could change when external pressure and internal leadership combined to demand it.